Long exposure photography is one of the most amazing techniques I ever saw. But it's a really expensive technique. With filters that can cost around 200 euros and a lot of gear to buy, I wanted to find a way to do it for cheap. This is a welding glass. It cost me $3 for 3 glasses. The only one that is interesting is the actual welding glass. So it cost around €1. With the help of 2 rubber bands, I managed to mount my glass on my camera lens. And then it was possible to take a 30 seconds exposure in daylight. As you can see, the water became like a mirror. You can see here a fast exposure photo versus a 30-second photo and the effect it has. With the welding glass, I managed to do some really interesting photos, impossible to do with a normal lens, with a really long exposure time. Water becomes like a mirror. Because it has a really strong green casting, it will be hard to get the original colors back. So the best solution, if you can't go back to the original colors, is to just migrate to black and white. But with some time and some Photoshop magic, you can have a pretty decent result with the colors. So to know if it's a good idea to use a $1 filter to do long exposure photography, I asked one of the most famous long exposure photographers in the world right now. Thibaut Roland, who is also a French photographer, took some time to give me his opinion on this weird and cheap technique, and also give you some tips about long exposure photography.
Hello everyone, my name is Thibaut Roland. I am a black and white fine art photographer, and I specialize in long exposure and tilt shift techniques, and mostly do seascapes, landscapes, and architecture. My work has been shown in different places, among others in the US and in France. And I also teach and organize workshops for people who want to learn about these techniques as well as fine art photography. When you stretch out time, you're looking at an entirely different environment and time scale, in that you're just changing what you're looking at in your environment and making it entirely eerie and very special and very unique. I started doing long exposure, I think probably 5 or 6 years ago, when I bought my first ND filter, which I think at the time was an ND400. And looking back at it now, I know that an ND400 is not very dark and wouldn't allow me to really get exposure times any longer than 15 or 30 seconds during daytime, which is quite different from what I'm doing now, which is more in the 3 minutes or 5 minutes or even 10 minutes range. But all that being said, that was more than enough for me to start experimenting. Long exposure photography is actually quite expensive technique when you're serious about it, because it requires gear. So photography itself is already expensive, but when you're shooting long exposure, and now I'm talking about more than 1 second, or even half a minute or a minute, well, then there's just no way that you can hold the camera still with your hands so that the end result will be good. The camera will be shaking and your image will be terrible. So to do that, you need a pretty sturdy tripod. And sturdy tripods, you have to count already in, at the very least, 150, 200 and US dollars. And it can go up by any amount. On top of that, you may want to add a nice ball head or geared head, which will be an extra $200 or $300. So you're already at around $500. But because you may want to be doing long exposure during the day, the only way you can do that is by using neutral density filters, so that you will be cutting out part of the light that goes through the lens, just like basically sunglasses work. And there are all kinds of neutral density filters, some that are good, some that are bad, and anything in between. But you have to also add an extra 50-ish dollars to somewhere like around $200, depending on which filter you want to use, or also what kind of shape. If it's a screw-in filter, it's usually a little cheaper than a square filter because you also have to add a holder to it. So the bill starts going up and up, and like I said, this is pretty expensive. From the images that I saw that were captured using the welding glass filter, I would say that the result is actually pretty decent. It's obviously not perfect. I did notice that optically there are some issues. There's a very strong color cast, for instance, in these images before converting them to black and white. But I guess if you're using the filter for black and white photography anyways, this is about fine. My main concern that I noticed is that parts of the images on the left especially are actually pretty blurred. So it could be that the optical quality of the filter is actually, of course, granted, it's going to be pretty low, but it's not homogeneous either. And you also have to keep in mind that this filter was actually mounted using really a couple strings. So this is in no way going to be as good as using a filter holder, obviously, but for a piece of glass that costs $1 or €1, it's not bad. At least it will let people start messing around and experimenting with long exposure, longish exposure, about 30 seconds long, which is not bad really for the price. When it comes to pros and cons, the definite pro is the price. There is pretty much nothing else that will let you start experimenting with long exposure technique for that cheap. Because it's also that cheap, you don't need to worry about breaking the filter or scratching the filter, which is a big worry for people who are actually serious about long exposure photography, because when you are using a $150 piece of glass, and you know that if anything happens, if it falls, it will break, and you've got to buy another one. This is not something that you want to go through. So having something that cheap is definitely a good thing. Now, I would say this is probably the only good thing. The color cast is quite terrible. You would not be able to get any natural color with such a filter, which would be okay, sort of, if you were converting to black and white. But because probably the filter is not neutral, meaning that it won't cut out as much, let's say, red as it will cut out green, for instance. So as a conclusion, I would say that the welding glass option is very cool. Lots of fun. Great way to actually start looking into long exposure photography and try and see whether this is your thing or not. But this is probably something that you will be doing just a couple times to try out, which is totally cool, totally fine, because this is so cheap. But once you realize that you want to be doing more long exposure photography, then it's time to actually invest in the good filters. And these good filters will cost much more than this option. Be prepared for it, but you get what you pay for. And then you'll know that optically you will get great images. But that being said, um, I think welding glass is a really cool toy, really cool option. Great job, Matthew. For those of you who want to give long exposure a try, I would say that you should get prepared to experiment and try a lot of different things. And be prepared because it will take a while. But it's very exciting, it's very fun. That being said, I do have a few tricks that can help you kick started. First of all, turn off the wind stabilization feature of your camera, because when it's on, more often than not, it will actually mess up with the capture, meaning that the image that you will get is going to be pretty blurred. Another thing you probably want to turn off is the long exposure noise reduction feature, because that will pretty much double the time that the camera will take to capture one image. It will actually process the image that was captured with the same amount of time that it took for the actual exposure of the image. And I'm patient, but I'm not that patient. So I don't want to have to wait for 10 minutes when I actually have a 5-minute long exposure. And I'm guessing this is going to be the same for you. And the last tip that I can give you is that, especially when you're using very, very strong density filters, you want to be doing the focus without the filter. Make sure that the focus is perfect. Then you remove the autofocus if you were using the autofocus before you actually put the filter on and take the picture. Otherwise, if the autofocus is still on, then the camera and the lens will be basically looking for the focal position, and most probably the focus will be wrong. So you don't want that to happen. So do the focus before you put on the filter, put the filter on, remove the autofocus, and then you can actually take the picture.